The rain came down in relentless sheets, cold and heavy, blurring the edges of the narrow country road. The man gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup, its wipers squeaking in protest with each slow pass. The road was slick with mud, the sky awash of gray and shadow. He had just finished his evening shift at a construction site miles away, his hands aching, clothes damp with the day's work. His mind drifted to his little girl waiting at home, probably curled under the threadbare blanket, humming the lullaby her mother used to sing before she passed away. He had promised to bring her something sweet tonight, maybe a candy bar or her favorite biscuits if the store hadn't closed yet. As his truck rumbled down the empty stretch, a flash of red lights ahead caught his attention. He slowed down, squinting through the rain. A car sat stranded by the roadside, steam rising from its hood like smoke from a dying fire. The figure of a woman stood beside it, drenched, waving faintly at the passing vehicles that didn't stop. Her face was half hidden by the downpour, but her desperation was unmistakable. He hesitated for a brief moment, feeling the exhaustion in his bones, the ache in his stomach from skipping dinner again. Yet, something inside him refused to drive past. He pulled over, his tires sinking slightly into the muddy edge of the road. The truck coughed as he turned off the ignition, and for a second, the only sound was the steady rhythm of the rain pounding against the roof. He reached behind the seat for his worn-out jacket, the one patched in too many places to count, and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him like icy needles, soaking through his clothes instantly. He trudged toward the stranded car, boots squelching in the mud. The woman looked at him with a mixture of fear and relief, uncertain whether to trust a stranger in such a dark place. He simply nodded, eyes kind, hands steady. He lifted the hood and peered inside, steam and heat fogging his vision. His fingers, though rough and chilled, worked with a certain grace born from years of fixing what little he had. The engine hissed, sputtered, and after several attempts, began to rumble weakly back to life. The woman gasped, covering her mouth, visibly grateful. She tried to hand him some money, bills trembling in her wet hand, but he stepped back and shook his head. His expression was humble but firm. He didn't need thanks or reward. He had done what any decent soul would do, or at least what he believed they should. He gave a small wave, turned back to his pickup, and climbed inside, dripping water onto the seat. He watched her taillights fade through the foggy road until they vanished completely, swallowed by the storm. Then he started his old truck again, the engine groaning as it rolled forward, headlights cutting through the darkness. The world around him was empty and cold, but inside that small cab, there was a quiet peace, the kind that comes from doing good when no one is watching. The old pickup creaked as it pulled into the narrow alley behind a crumbling apartment block, its headlights sweeping across the faded walls and rusted gates. The man parked carefully, turning off the engine to save what little fuel he had left. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but he was drenched, his clothes clinging to his skin, his boots heavy with mud. He sat for a moment, leaning back against the seat, his breath fogging the window as he exhaled. The silence was deep, the kind that pressed on the chest and made the world feel small. He wiped his face with his sleeve and looked at the small paper bag beside him, 2 biscuits and a packet of milk, bought with the last few coins he had left in his pocket. He stepped out of the truck, careful not to slam the door, and made his way to the staircase that led up to his tiny rented room. The hallway light flickered weakly, casting long, uncertain shadows along the damp walls. The air smelled faintly of rain and old paint. He climbed the stairs slowly, the wood creaking under his weight, each step echoing softly in the stillness. When he reached the top, he paused outside a door that had been repaired with tape and a prayer, the number faded almost to nothing. From inside came a faint humming, a soft, sleepy tune, off-key but full of innocence. He opened the door gently. The small room was dimly lit by a candle set in a glass jar, its flame dancing against the cracked walls. His daughter lay curled on a thin mattress, a blanket pulled up to her chin. Her hair was messy, her face calm and peaceful in sleep. The old stuffed bear she never let go of rested in her arms, its fur worn thin from years of being held too tight. The man stood there for a long moment, watching her, his exhaustion melting away into something softer, something that almost felt like peace. He moved quietly, setting the paper bag on the small table beside her pillow, where she would see it when she woke up. The room was almost bare, a few clothes hanging on a string, a cracked mirror propped against the wall, a picture of his late wife tucked into the corner of the frame. In that photo, she was smiling, holding their daughter as a baby, sunlight pouring over both of them. He looked at it every night before sleeping, a silent reminder of why he kept fighting, why he never gave up even when the world seemed determined to break him. He sat on the edge of the mattress, careful not to wake the little girl, and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Her small hand twitched, reaching for his, and he let her fingers wrap around one of his, their grip faint but full of trust. The candlelight flickered against his face, highlighting the deep lines carved by years of struggle and worry. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, but inside that small, crumbling space, there was warmth. The rhythm of her breathing steadied him, grounding him in the quiet truth that as long as she was safe, as long as she had him, everything else could be endured. He leaned back against the wall, his head resting beside the candle's soft glow, and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the day slowly lift. Morning crept in through the thin curtains, pale light filtering across the cracks in the wall. The man stirred awake, his back stiff from sleeping on the floor beside his daughter's bed. The sound of distant traffic blended with the dripping of last night's rain from the eaves outside. His daughter was still asleep, her small hand clutching the biscuit wrapper, crumbs scattered over the blanket. He smiled faintly, brushing them away, and stood up slowly, careful not to wake her. The air was cold, and the faint smell of damp wood filled the tiny room. He washed his face using a chipped plastic bowl of water, the shock of the cold waking him fully. He dressed in his only formal shirt, the one he kept neatly folded at the back of the drawer, slightly wrinkled but clean. It was the same shirt he wore to job interviews, the same one he wore to his wife's funeral, and now it would serve him once again for something just as important. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror, adjusting the collar, combing his hair with his fingers. The reflection staring back at him looked older than his years, tired eyes, skin weathered by work and worry. He took a deep breath and reached for a worn envelope lying on the small wooden table. Inside were the papers that had kept him awake night after night. Eviction notices, overdue bills, and the official letter summoning him to court. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered the documents and placed them carefully into an old folder. He looked back at his daughter one last time before leaving, tucking the blanket around her shoulders and whispering something under his breath that only he could hear. Outside, the city was waking up. Vendors were setting up their carts, buses groaned along the wet streets, and the smell of tea and fried bread filled the air. He walked quickly, clutching his folder against his chest to keep it dry, his worn shoes splashing through puddles. The courthouse loomed ahead, its tall, gray pillars casting long shadows across the steps. The building seemed cold and unwelcoming, the kind of place where people's lives were decided in silence. He paused at the entrance, gathering his courage, then pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The waiting area was filled with people. Men in suits, women with tired eyes, families huddled together in quiet worry. He found an empty seat on a wooden bench and sat down, his hands clasped tightly, the folder resting on his knees. His stomach churned from nerves and hunger, but he didn't care about food. All he could think of was his daughter, the thought of losing her gnawing at his chest. He replayed everything in his mind. The accident that cost him his job, the hospital bills he couldn't pay, the landlord's warnings, the nights he held his crying child as she asked why her mother wasn't coming back. He tried to steady his breathing, to remind himself that he had done everything he could. Around him, voices murmured softly, echoing through the marble halls, but his world had narrowed down to a single thought: today would decide everything. He looked toward the courtroom door, its polished wood reflecting the faint glimmer of light from the high windows. Soon, he would have to walk through it, stand before a stranger, and hope that mercy still existed somewhere in that cold, official world. The courtroom was vast and still, the air heavy with a sense of finality that made every sound echo louder than it should. The man stood near the front, his folder clutched tightly in his hands, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The wooden benches behind him were half full of people waiting for their own cases, but to him, the room felt empty. The walls were lined with shelves of old legal books, the scent of paper and varnish mixing faintly in the air. A clerk moved briskly across the front, arranging files and whispering instructions, while the bailiff stood by the door, motionless and stern. The man's eyes wandered to the judge's seat, still unoccupied, framed by the soft morning light spilling in through tall windows. He had never been in a courtroom before. He didn't know the rules, didn't understand the formal words written in his notices. All he knew was that this was the day everything could change, the day someone else would decide if he was worthy of keeping the only family he had left. He tried to stand tall, but his shoulders hunched from years of labor and struggle. His shirt, though clean, clung awkwardly to his back where it had not dried completely from the rain that morning. He rubbed his hands together to calm himself, the roughness of his skin reminding him of all the work he had done, all the sacrifices that had led him here. When the side door opened, he looked up instinctively. The judge entered, a figure of quiet authority in black robes, every step deliberate, every movement controlled. The room stood as she took her place, and when everyone sat again, her gaze briefly swept over the crowd before settling on the next case. She adjusted her glasses, opened the file before her, and began reading. The man lowered his eyes, staring at the floor, unaware that her gaze lingered a moment longer than usual. In that pause, a faint flicker of recognition crossed her face. The memory surfaced suddenly. A cold night, a stranded car, a man stepping out of his truck in the rain. She remembered the soaked jacket, the calloused hands that had fixed her engine, the quiet refusal of her offer to pay him. For a second, the courtroom around her faded into the background, replaced by the image of that lonely road and the man's steady, wordless kindness. It was him. She was certain. She composed herself quickly, pushing the thought aside to maintain the decorum the position demanded, but something within her shifted. She looked at him again, seeing not just another case file but a man who had once extended help without expectation. He, however, remained unaware, his focus fixed on the folder trembling slightly in his hands. His life lay written in those pages, missed payments, lost wages, hospital records, his daughter's name appearing in cold legal text. To the world, he was just another struggling parent facing the system, but to her, he had become something more, a living reminder that compassion could exist even in desperation. The courtroom clock ticked softly, marking the slow passage of time. The air carried a tension that neither of them spoke, a connection built on a single act of selflessness now resurfacing in the most unexpected place. She straightened her shoulders, her eyes scanning the papers once more, but her mind was already weighing more than just evidence and law. The hearing began with the shuffle of papers and the low murmur of formal words that meant little to the man standing there. He felt small in that room, surrounded by polished wood and the faint rustle of authority. His lawyer spoke in careful phrases, explaining his situation, the accident at the factory, the medical bills that swallowed his savings, the job he lost because of the injury. Every sentence felt like a confession, every detail peeling away the quiet pride he had tried so hard to hold on to. Across the aisle, the opposing lawyer presented cold facts, the unpaid rent, the inconsistent income, the instability of his living conditions. Each statement hit like a hammer, reducing his years of struggle to a list of failures. The man stood silently, his rough hands clasped in front of him, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. He wanted to speak, to explain how he had done everything he could, how his daughter's smile was the only reason he woke up every morning. But the words caught in his throat. The judge listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, her eyes occasionally flicking between the documents and the man before her. The sound of rain tapping faintly against the tall windows filled the pauses between the legal exchanges, a soft reminder of the world outside where people went about their lives, unaware that a man's future was being decided in that still room. When the lawyer placed the last document on the desk, the silence that followed was thick and heavy. The judge leaned back slightly, fingertips pressed together as she read through the file once more. Every line told a story she had seen too many times: hardship, loss, exhaustion. But as her eyes traced the familiar pattern of poverty, something different stirred within her. She saw not just the paperwork, but the man standing behind it. She saw the soaked jacket he wore that night, the mud on his boots, the sincerity in his eyes when he had refused her money. He had expected nothing, not even recognition, and now he stood before her, unaware that his small act of kindness had already reached the heart that held his fate. The courtroom waited as she picked up her pen. The scratch of ink against paper was the only sound. She read the last paragraph aloud, her voice steady, her tone calm. The decision she gave was fair, measured, yet it carried a quiet mercy beneath the surface. She granted him custody of his daughter, acknowledging his efforts, his character, and the circumstances beyond his control. She ordered a review of his case for social assistance, a step that might finally give him a chance to rebuild. The man's shoulders slumped as if a great weight had been lifted. He didn't fully understand the legal terms, but he could feel the shift in the air, the relief, the release. His eyes lifted slowly, meeting hers for the first time. In that silent exchange, recognition flickered just briefly, like a spark in the dimness. She offered no smile, only a look that held something deeper than formality, a quiet gratitude, a sense of closure, and an understanding that life had brought their paths together for a reason. The clerk began to collect the papers, and people moved about again, but the moment lingered. The man turned to leave, his steps heavy but lighter than they had been in months. Outside the courtroom doors, the world seemed brighter, the storm clouds parting to reveal a thin ribbon of sunlight stretching across the courthouse steps. The courthouse doors opened with a groan, and the man stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The rain had finally stopped, leaving puddles that shimmered under a weak sun breaking through the clouds. For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing in deeply as if the weight of months had been washed away in that single breath. His folder was still in his hand, damp at the corners, the papers inside no longer heavy with fear. His daughter came running down the steps, her small shoes splashing through the water, her laughter carrying across the courtyard like a song. She threw her arms around his waist, clinging tightly, her joy pure and boundless. He bent down and lifted her, spinning her gently despite his aching back, the sound of her laughter chasing away everything that had once haunted his thoughts. The world seemed softer now. The sun glinted off the courthouse windows, the city noise fading into something distant and harmless. He looked at his daughter's face, bright and alive, her eyes wide with the simple trust only a child could have. She had no idea what had happened inside those walls, no understanding of how close they had come to losing everything. To her, it was just another day where her father smiled again, and that was enough. He set her down and took her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if the world had always meant for it to be that way. They walked down the steps slowly, each step a quiet victory, each breath a promise to never let life harden what love had kept alive. Behind them, through the tall courthouse window, the judge stood in her chambers, the same woman he had helped on that lonely night. She watched the two figures walking away, her eyes following them until they disappeared into the crowd. The memory of the rain-soaked road returned, the way he had offered help without a word, the steady kindness in his actions, the humility in his refusal to take anything in return. She had seen hundreds of faces in her courtroom, but few had stayed with her the way his did. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of her desk, the faintest smile touching her lips, not of pride but of quiet peace. Outside, the man and his daughter reached the edge of the street. He paused, looking up at the open sky, now streaked with light. His reflection shimmered faintly in a puddle at his feet, a worn man in old clothes, eyes tired but alive, holding the hand of a child who looked at the world with endless wonder. They crossed together, the city unfolding before them, no longer a place of struggle but of possibility. The sound of traffic, voices, and life filled the air around them. The man squeezed his daughter's hand, her fingers warm and small in his own, and they walked on, disappearing slowly into the rhythm of the world that had, at last, decided to give them both another chance. The small apartment was bathed in the soft orange glow of sunset when they returned home. The air smelled faintly of rain-soaked dust, and the room, though humble and bare, felt warmer than it had in months. The man set his daughter's school bag aside and helped her climb onto the small mattress by the window. She laughed as she pointed to the streaks of sunlight painting patterns across the wall, her voice filling the silence that had once felt suffocating. He sat beside her, his rough hands resting on his knees, the ache in his body dulled by the peace that had finally found its way into the tiny space they called home. For the first time in a long while, there was no dread waiting in the corners, no unopened envelopes lying on the table to remind him of what he couldn't change. He looked around the room, seeing not what it lacked but what it held, a few drawings his daughter had taped to the wall, the chipped mug she had painted for him at school, the old blanket that had kept them both warm through too many cold nights. Every piece of it carried a memory, a reminder of how far they had come through struggle and quiet perseverance. The candle that had once been their only source of light now sat unused, replaced by a faint hum from the small electric bulb that flickered overhead. It wasn't much, but it was something, and that something was enough. He walked over to the window and opened it, letting in the evening air. The city outside was alive again. Children playing in the street below, the smell of bread from a nearby shop, the distant chatter of neighbors sharing stories. His daughter called to him softly, holding up a small picture she had drawn that morning before court. Two stick figures holding hands beneath the sun, the words, "Me and Papa," scrawled in crooked letters beneath it. He took it from her with careful hands, his throat tightening as he looked at it. It was simple, uneven, but to him it was more beautiful than any painting he had ever seen. He pinned the drawing above the bed, smoothing the edges gently so it wouldn't tear. His daughter climbed onto the mattress again, curling up with her stuffed bear as sleep began to tug at her eyelids. He sat beside her, brushing her hair back, feeling the soft rhythm of her breathing slow as she drifted into dreams. Outside, the sun dipped lower, and the first lights of the evening began to flicker across the city. The faint hum of life carried through the open window, blending with the sound of her breathing, creating a kind of quiet music that wrapped around the small room like a blanket. He leaned back, his gaze lifting to the ceiling, his thoughts heavy but calm. For years he had fought against everything the world had thrown at him, barely holding on, but tonight there was no fight left, only peace. The shadows softened, the light faded, and in that stillness, for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to simply exist without fear of what tomorrow might bring. The judge sat alone in her office long after the courthouse had emptied, the evening quiet pressing gently against the tall windows. The faint hum of the city drifted in from below, mingling with the rustle of papers still scattered across her desk. The room, usually filled with voices, footsteps, and decisions, now felt like a sanctuary of thought. She leaned back in her chair, her robe folded neatly beside her, and stared at the small lamp casting a warm pool of light over the wooden surface. The file from earlier in the day lay open before her, his name printed neatly at the top, the documents beneath now marked with her final decision. She had signed her judgment hours ago, but the case lingered in her mind, deeper than any she had presided over in years. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the last light of day faded behind the skyline. The reflection of her face in the glass looked different somehow, softer, more human than the firm, composed expression she showed the world. She remembered that night again with startling clarity, the downpour, the broken car, the man stepping out of the darkness with quiet purpose. She remembered the look in his eyes, weary but kind, and the way he had refused her money with a simple shake of his head. It had been such a small moment then, but now it felt monumental, a point in time that had quietly altered the course of two lives. She realized that the line between those who judged and those who were judged was far thinner than most people believed. She stood and walked toward a small shelf against the wall where framed photographs lined the top. Among them were moments from her past, family gatherings, graduation ceremonies, the early days of her career when she still believed the law alone could mend the world's fractures. But somewhere along the way, the weight of years and countless verdicts had hardened her edges. She traced a finger over one frame, her younger self smiling with unguarded conviction, and she wondered when compassion had become something she had to consciously remember instead of something that came naturally. Her eyes returned to the open file on the desk. The man's life, written in black ink, told a story of hardship, of love trying to survive against all odds. Yet beyond the printed words, she had seen what couldn't be recorded, his humility, his quiet endurance, the gentleness with which he looked at his child. She closed the file slowly and tied it with a thin piece of twine, her fingers lingering on the paper as if sealing a chapter she didn't want to forget. For a long while, she stood by the window again, watching the city lights flicker to life. Somewhere out there, she imagined, he was probably sitting with his daughter, sharing a simple meal, maybe laughing for the first time in months. The thought brought a faint warmth to her chest, a feeling that perhaps justice had, for once, aligned with something greater than law, with grace. The clock ticked softly in the background, marking the quiet passage of time as the world outside kept moving, unknowing of how fate had turned quietly and beautifully within one courtroom that day.